And today we will discuss Young v. Clark. But from here until the exam, we have no new cases. So this is our last case. So congratulations. Who would like to read? Let's get right into it. Young v. Clark. In this case, we're dealing with a doctrine. What doctrine are we dealing with before we begin? The emergency, the sudden emergency doctrine. As Justice Holmes say in the other cases, in the Hay case, if there was a disability, a physical disability, the objective standard might be flexible, where an individual has a physical disability, such as the loss of an eye or the loss of an arm. And in that situation, they still have a duty of care. They still have a standard, but the standard changes a little bit. It changes to that of one who has that disability. What could a person in that same situation have done? And this case is no different. The standard is shifting from what would a reasonably prudent person do to what would a person do in an emergency like this. In emergencies, you don't always have time to make the correct decision. And if you don't make the correct decision, you're not always negligent. Just because you make an incorrect decision does not mean you're negligent. In this case, why couldn't the defendant make a correct decision? Because everything happened fast. And right during that time that she is switching lanes, this car stops, and this car stops, and the defendant hits the plaintiff's car, injuring the plaintiff. Now the question is there an emergency? Does this constitute an emergency where the defendant would be entitled to the defense of the emergency doctrine, sudden emergency doctrine? So let's get into the reading. Who would like to read? Would you please read? First paragraph? First few paragraphs. We have the car going into the right lane and then back into the center lane immediately, forcing all of the other cars to apply their brakes. Let's continue. Was there a trial? Let's look closely. Let's look a little more closely. Would you read that last paragraph beginning with the jury?
The jury found that the Young's injuries were not performed under the circumstances of this particular case.
Okay, so there was a trial. It tells us so. The jury found the Young's injuries were not caused by any negligence on the Clark's part. So we had a trial. Why did they find no negligence? Well, if we look right above that, read that paragraph right above the paragraph you just read.
The trial?
Yes, sir.
The trial court submitted the issue of cross.
Before the jury begins to deliberate, after all the witnesses have been presented, after all the pieces of evidence have been shown to the jury, the judge hands the jury a statute. What is that statute? It's the sudden emergency doctrine of Colorado. And so the judge gives the jury this piece of advice or this tool to use. And he says to the jury, consider this doctrine. You are allowed to consider this doctrine in this case. These are important procedural facts because this is what the appeal is based on. And then what does the jury do with it? The jury uses it and they find the defendant not guilty. And so now we can guess what the appeal is going to be. Holmes say about standards, the usual standard is the objective standard. What would a reasonably prudent person do? But in this case, Holmes is a little flexible. What would a reasonably prudent person do in an emergency like this? Even if they make the wrong decision. Because you can't always make the right decision in life. There are going to be times when you are confronted with an emergency, or you have 1 more minute on the exam, And you'd be able to, you would answer the question correctly if you had 5 minutes, but you only have 5 seconds. It's the sudden emergency doctrine. Now that's not a defense. Next exam, don't use that as a defense. Professor, I didn't get it right. I was confronted with the sudden emergency doctrine. I had 5 seconds left to answer 5 questions. But anyway, you get the point. Sometimes you can't make the correct decision because you don't have time to adequately think. Let's continue reading, please. The individual still has a duty of care. He still has a standard of care. This defendant is still responsible, but she is responsible to act in a responsibly prudent way considering the circumstances. We're not giving anybody a free pass here. The plaintiff argues that it was a mistake to allow consideration of the sudden emergency doctrine. That's what this issue is. That's what this case is about. Why? Why is she arguing that? How? How can she argue that? Anybody? Why can she argue that? Why does she attempt to argue that? That the sudden emergency doctrine should not be considered in this situation. What do you think?
Because they think he has enough time to think.
That's a good guess. We're getting there. But what that's related to is, who caused the emergency? Well, we know this car caused it, but who else might have caused it? Is that the plaintiff is accusing the defendant of contributing to the emergency, of causing the emergency. How could the defendant have caused this emergency? How close was the defendant to the car? We don't know. But is that a relevant fact? So if the defendant caused or helped to cause this emergency, then the defendant will be precluded from using the sudden emergency doctrine. We don't know how fast she was driving, and we don't know how closely she was driving. The factual dispute of whether Clark was following too closely was correctly given to the jury to decide. It's up to the jury. The jury decides facts. Does the jury create law? No. The jury does not create law. The jury applies the law to the facts. Was the defendant driving too closely? Well, that's a fact that is in dispute. Yes or no? I don't know. Let's let the jury decide. And so the judge gives this to the jury. He gives them the opportunity to decide the facts. Court's decision?
No negligence by Clark.
No negligence by Clark. But what did the trial court do to the jury? What was the issue in this case? They gave them what?
Emergency instruction.
Instructions to consider the sudden emergency doctrine. But really, we're just looking at a different objective standard. The standard is changing a little bit from an objective one to one under these circumstances. But you can't create the situation and then say, sudden emergency. You arrive to the exam. Let's say you arrive late. You arrive 5 minutes before the exam ends. And then you claim sudden emergency doctrine. I'm in a sudden emergency. I don't have time. Who created that emergency? You. If you arrive late, you created the emergency by arriving late. And that's what the plaintiff is claiming here. The plaintiff is claiming that this defendant has created or helped to create the emergency. But if you arrive on time and you have your notes and you've studied all year long and then you have 5, and you're working the entire hour and 15 minutes, and you still have 10 questions, and you have 5 seconds to answer 10 questions, then you might be able to use the sudden emergency doctrine. And then through no fault of your own, all of a sudden you're confronted with a car in the middle of the road that stopped. You're confronted with an emergency, and it's not your fault. That's all this case is. And so in that situation, then the standard can change. It's a little bit flexible, as Holmes told us earlier.